You started with warmth because it felt natural. You didn't know another way. Your instinct was to help, to care, to hold space for people who didn't know how to return it. You didn't count favors. You didn't keep receipts. You loved without fear, trusted without proof, forgave without asking why. It wasn't about being naive. It was about believing in people more than they believed in themselves. That belief, that soft edge, was your default, until it became the weapon used against you. You didn't see the shift right away. It starts small. They ignore your feelings but expect you to hold theirs. They joke at your expense and call it love. They disappear when you need them, then reappear like nothing happened. And you let them, because kindness makes excuses. Because you think, maybe they're just going through something. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe you're just sensitive. So you stay. You give again. You soften more. You learn the hard way that some people don't see softness as love. They see it as access, as permission, as a green light to take what they want and leave what they don't. You gave your time, your energy, your loyalty, not because they earned it, but because that's who you were. They didn't value that. They drained it, took it for granted. And the worst part, they knew. They knew you would forgive, knew you'd pick up the phone, knew you'd show up anyway. And they used it. There were moments you cried quietly, not because they hurt you, but because you let it keep happening. You questioned yourself. You wondered why they kept disrespecting the love you offered. But it wasn't about you. It was about them. Your softness only exposed the hollowness in others. People with no emotional depth don't know how to handle people who feel everything. They mock what they don't understand, and your kindness was foreign to them. You remember the times you went out of your way. Long messages, unreturned calls, plans canceled last minute. The way they rolled their eyes when you asked for effort. The way they sighed when you needed a moment to talk. But you kept giving because you thought that was strength. Being there no matter what, loving through anything. But now you know, love without boundaries isn't love. It's self-destruction. They saw your patience as stupidity, your empathy as weakness. And instead of protecting your kindness, they used it to sharpen their own selfishness. They knew you wouldn't fight back. You were too understanding, too soft-spoken. You didn't explode, you imploded. And they took that silence as a victory. You started noticing patterns. They never called unless they needed something. They remembered you only when their life fell apart. You were the fixer, the listener, the one who absorbed everyone else's pain while hiding your own. And when you finally broke down, they vanished. Because they didn't love you. They loved what you gave them. And the moment you needed the same thing back, they were gone. You saw them support others, cheer louder for strangers, post about loyalty while ghosting your reality. And still, part of you tried to understand. Still, you thought maybe it was your fault, that maybe you expected too much. But it wasn't too much. You just asked the wrong people. You were the friend who remembered every date, every detail, every fear they told you. You held their hands in their storms, gave money when you didn't have enough for yourself, stayed up late talking them through their lowest nights. You were their anchor, their calm, their safety. But when it was your turn to sink, they watched from a distance with clean hands and dry eyes. People say don't change, stay kind, stay loving, but they don't talk about how kindness without protection turns into a trap, how it draws in the takers, the manipulators, the emotionally unavailable. They call you too much when you're just being real. They say you're dramatic when you're just honest. And you shrink. You water yourself down to keep the peace, to avoid being abandoned. Again. There were days you felt proud of being the one who cared, thought it made you strong, and in a way, it did. But strength isn't about staying soft while people crush you. It's about knowing when to stop handing your heart to those who treat it like a toy. You weren't soft because you were weak. You were soft because you believed love was the answer, that loyalty would be returned, that people would see your heart and treat it with the same care. But they didn't. The truth is, most people don't value something until it's gone. They don't realize your kindness had limits until you finally reach them. And when you do, when you finally stop calling, stop showing up, stop bending, they call you chain, cold, distant. But they never ask what made you that way. They only miss the version of you they could take advantage of. Now you look back and see it clearly. You see the hands that only reached out when it was convenient. You see the fake concern masked as friendship. You see how they took and gave nothing real in return. And you don't hate them, but you'll never let them back in, because they had access to the best parts of you, and they wasted it. That softness still lives in you, but it's guarded now, protected. Not for everyone, not for people who treat hearts like disposable things. You learned, and that lesson came with pain, but it also came with power. They thought you'd stay soft forever, that no matter how many times they cut you, you'd come back whole. But you didn't. You came back different, and they'll never get to touch that softness again. Not now, not ever. You were too patient, too kind. You waited for people to show up long after they stopped trying. You gave space. You gave chances. You told yourself they were just going through something, that maybe they needed time. So you stayed. You stayed even when the silence started to feel louder than the connection. You stayed when it hurt. And every time you hoped it would get better, that they'd remember your loyalty, that your consistency would matter. But it didn't. They took and kept taking, and you kept offering. You wanted peace, not attention. You weren't looking to be repaid. You just wanted the same energy back. That was all. You wanted them to see you, to show up for you the way you did for them. But that day never came. Not fully, not sincerely. They texted when they needed something, called when their life fell apart. And you? You picked up every time. No questions, no blame, just presence. You thought love meant staying, even when it hurt. You thought being real meant carrying other people's pain with your own. So you did, quietly, with a soft heart and tired hands. You poured into them, checked on them, showed up on bad days and worse nights. And when you needed someone, there was nothing. Just silence or excuses, or worse, fake apologies followed by the same behavior. You told yourself it was okay, that not everyone was capable of giving the way you give. But that wasn't the truth. They could give. They just didn't want to give to you. They saved their best for someone else. And you still stayed, hoping that if you held on just a little longer, maybe they'd choose you, choose to be better, choose to value what you gave so freely. But they didn't, and slowly, your softness started to feel like self-betrayal. You were stretching for people who wouldn't lift a finger for you, bending until your back broke. They watched you carry their chaos like it was nothing, and when you started sinking, they looked away. Your tears made them uncomfortable. Your pain was an inconvenience. You started to notice things, how they only reached out when they needed something, how they never remembered your important days, but expected you to remember all of theirs. How they'd go silent when you needed support, then reappear with a story that somehow made your pain about them. It wasn't a partnership. It was performance, one-sided loyalty. You blamed yourself at first, wondered if maybe you were too much, too emotional, too sensitive. Maybe your standards were unrealistic. But then you looked around, looked at who was left, looked at how empty it felt despite everything you gave. And the truth was clear. They didn't value you, not the real you. They valued your access, your support, your consistency. They loved how you made them feel, but not who you were. Every scar you carry came from someone you tried to save, someone you stayed soft for when you should have walked away. You weren't trying to be a hero. You were just trying to love people through their pain. But some people don't want to be healed. They just want someone to bleed with them, someone to lean on while they destroy themselves. And you became that person. The worst part, you never even got a thank you. Just distance, just disrespect. They ghosted you after you gave them everything. They moved on like you were a phase, like your care was disposable. But you remember everything. Every time you sat with them while they cried, every late night call, every ride you gave, every dollar you lent without asking for it back. They forgot. You never did. And you still tried to protect their name. Still made excuses for them when people asked what happened. You didn't want them to look bad. You didn't want to speak on it. But the silence became heavy. It sat on your chest like regret. Because you weren't just hurt. You were erased, treated like a tool instead of a human. And it changed something in you. The scars taught you what love isn't. Love isn't one-sided effort. Love doesn't leave you empty. Love doesn't only show up when it's convenient. Love isn't supposed to feel like survival. You realized you were dying on hills that weren't yours to climb, fighting battles that weren't even yours. And no one ever came to rescue you. You rescued them over and over, but no one came for you. And that's when it shifted. That's when the softness stopped feeling beautiful. When it started to feel dangerous. You didn't stop caring. You just stopped bleeding for people who wouldn't offer a band-aid. You stopped showing up uninvited. You stopped pouring into hands that only took. You stopped explaining your heart to people and committed to misunderstanding it. You were never weak. You were wounded. You weren't naive. You were loyal. You weren't asking for too much. You were asking the wrong people. And they'll never admit what they did. They'll never say sorry. But the scar doesn't need their apology. It tells the story loud enough on its own. You survived people who were never meant to hold you. Now you wear those scars like warnings, not walls, but wisdom. They remind you of the cost of loving without boundaries, of giving to those who only know how to take, of staying too long in places where your presence was only tolerated, never valued, and you'll never make that mistake again. They thought you'd stay soft, thought no matter what they did, you'd always answer. You were always the one who forgave first, reached out first, cared most. You were the one who remembered birthdays, who checked in even after being ignored, who listened to problems but never shared your own. They saw how you moved, how you loved, how you gave everything without asking for anything in return. And they thought it made you weak. You weren't soft because you didn't know better. You were soft because you chose to be. You believed in people. You gave them the benefit of the doubt. You made excuses for their silence, their distance, their cruelty. You thought if you loved harder, they'd change. If you stayed loyal, they'd notice. You believed the way you treated them would inspire them to treat you the same. But it didn't. They pushed your limits, and you kept showing grace. They crossed lines, and you redrew them further away. They lied, and you forgave. They disappointed, and you waited for them to make it right, over and over. You didn't leave. You stayed. You swallowed pain. just to keep peace. You held space for people who didn't even value your presence. They didn't think you'd ever change because you had set yourself on fire too many times just to keep them warm. They thought you'd never stop, that you'd always pick up the phone, no matter how long it rang one-sided. They thought you'd always make space for them, even after they left you hanging. You were the safe place, the backup plan, the one who would always be there when everything else went wrong. They never asked if you were okay. They never noticed the exhaustion behind your eyes. You became an emotional landfill. Everyone dumped, and no one cleaned up after themselves. Your softness was mistaken for stupidity. They thought you didn't notice. The passive aggression, the way they only called when they needed something, the fake concern masked as friendliness. You noticed. You just didn't react. You believed in giving people time to grow, to figure it out. But the longer you waited, the more you realized you weren't waiting for their growth. You were waiting for your own breaking point. And it came quietly, not in rage, not in a dramatic goodbye, but in your silence, in your withdrawal, in your sudden decision to stop caring for those who clearly didn't care for you. One day, you just stopped reaching out, stopped checking in, stopped carrying guilt for choosing yourself. That's when they started noticing. That's when the questions started. You've changed. Why are you distant? What happened? What happened is you woke up. You realized softness without boundaries is self-sabotage, that love without limits invites disrespect, that kindness in the wrong hands becomes currency for manipulation. You didn't harden because of one heartbreak. You hardened because of repeated neglect, repeated disappointment, the kind that's loud in silence, the kind that doesn't even apologize. It just keeps taking. They thought your patience was eternal, that your heart would always make room, no matter how many times they trashed it. But even the softest soul gets tired. You weren't being dramatic. You were protecting what was left of you. You stopped arguing, stopped explaining. You let people think what they wanted to think. You just didn't show up like you used to, and that shift shook them more than any confrontation ever could. They never imagined a version of you that could be unavailable, detached, emotionally distant. They relied on your softness to avoid accountability. As long as you stayed kind, they didn't have to face who they were. But now they do. Now they're forced to sit with the weight of your absence, and it's heavier than your presence ever was. People love the version of you that doesn't require them to grow, that accepts bare minimums, that waits, that forgives, that bends. But once you start expecting effort, energy, honesty, they panic because they weren't invested in you. They were addicted to how easy you made it for them. You were never too much. You were just too available for people who were too little. And now, you're not anymore. You stopped showing up uninvited. You stopped accepting breadcrumbs. You stopped keeping people close just because of history. You realized history means nothing if the present is full of pain. They thought you'd never change, that you'd stay soft no matter what. But softness without self-respect is a slow death. You had to let that version of you go. Your silence now carries more weight than your words ever did. The boundaries you set speak louder than the long messages you used to send. You don't explain anymore. You don't beg people to care. If they want access, they have to earn it. Not with apologies, but with consistency, with presence, with proof. You're still kind, still loving, still loyal, but not blindly, not recklessly. You see things now. You pay attention. You don't second-guess your gut. When energy feels off, you leave. When effort is missing, you step back. You no longer offer softness to those who mistook it for softness they could exploit. You stopped making yourself smaller so others could feel big. You didn't become cruel. You just stopped being a cushion for everyone else's damage. You stopped bleeding yourself dry for people who wouldn't offer you a bandage. You stopped waiting for the people who were perfectly fine watching you fall. You got up. You healed. Quietly, slowly, and now they see the result. A version of you they can't manipulate, can't guilt, can't reach without effort. They regret it now. They don't say it, but it shows in how they suddenly remember your birthday, in how they react to your posts, in how they ask others about you, because they know they lost access. You didn't close the door out of hate. You closed it out of necessity. You had to, because staying soft in a world that sharpened itself against you wasn't strength. It was suicide, and you're finally choosing to live on your terms. You don't forget the silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that makes your chest feel like it's caving in. You were surrounded by people, yet alone. You laughed at dinner tables, but your smile didn't touch your eyes. You went to sleep, hoping someone would notice you were slipping, but they didn't. Not because you hid it well, because they weren't looking. You could have screamed, and they would have just turned the volume up on whatever distracted them. Rock bottom doesn't come with warning signs. It creeps in quietly, one disappointment at a time, one ignored message, one broken promise. Until your body is heavy, your mind is numb, and the days start blending together. No one claps for survival when you're still drowning. No one reaches out when you start fading. You kept showing up for everyone, but when you needed someone, anyone, no one showed up for you. You always answered their late-night calls, listened for hours, pulled them out of their darkness. But when you were stuck in yours, your phone stayed silent. The same people who called you their rock didn't notice when you cracked. You weren't asking for much, just presence, just, how are you, really? But you learned the hard way. Your softness wasn't appreciated. It was used. Some nights were harder than others. Nights when your heart beat too loud in your chest, and your mind kept repeating every moment you were overlooked. The tears weren't loud. They came quietly, the type that fall without warning and leave you staring at the ceiling, wondering how you became invisible to the people you showed up for the most. You posted online, hoping someone would read between the lines. They didn't. They double-tapped and scrolled past. Some even messaged with jokes. Others stayed completely quiet. Your vulnerability was seen, but not responded to. That's when you realized the applause was conditional. People celebrate you when you're strong, when you're shining. But the second you dim, they disappear. They called you the strong one, the dependable one. So they assumed you'd never break, but you did. You broke in places no one could see. You smiled through it, said you were fine, and they believed you. Not because it was true, but because it was easier. Easier than asking questions, easier than offering help. They left you to heal alone, then called you distant when you finally stopped reaching out. The ones you'd have dropped everything for didn't even ask why you went quiet. You spent nights replaying conversations, looking for signs, wondering if maybe you expected too much. But you weren't wrong for needing someone. You weren't weak for breaking. The only mistake was giving your heart to people who only knew how to take. You realized rock bottom isn't loud. It's not public. It's not always tragic in a dramatic way. Sometimes it's numb. It's waking up and not knowing why you should get out of bed. It's scrolling through your contacts and realizing you don't know who to call. It's cooking food you won't eat. It's watching your own shadow and wondering how long you've felt this empty. That's the kind of pain that changes you. You stopped expecting, not out of strength, but out of exhaustion. You didn't want to explain anymore. Didn't want to beg for space in hearts that were full of themselves. So you went quiet. You pulled back. You stopped updating people. You started keeping your pain to yourself because eventually you realized most people ask how you're doing just to be polite. They don't really want the truth. The softness in you started fading, not because you stopped loving, but because you started seeing clearly. You noticed who only checked on you when they needed something, who only remembered you when you were achieving, who never asked if you were okay unless you were visibly breaking. And even then, they made it about them. You sat with your sadness. You faced it alone. You cried in bathrooms, turned off your phone, and still showed up for work, for friends, for life. You became the master of pretending, but something inside you shifted. You weren't the same. The part of you that once tried to save everyone started pulling away, not out of malice, out of necessity. You didn't want to grow cold, but you did, slowly, quietly. You stopped replying to texts that drained you, stopped going places you weren't wanted, stopped explaining your boundaries. You stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. People noticed. They said you changed. They didn't realize they helped build the version of you they now call cold. Your softness used to make you bend. Now it makes you choose. You still feel. You still care. But not for everyone. You learned the difference between being a good person and being a doormat. Between love and self-abandonment. Between being loyal and being used. And that lesson came with a cost. Rock bottom taught you who's real, who sticks around when there's nothing to gain, who listens when you're not saying much, who shows up without being asked. The list was shorter than you expected, but it was real. You carry that with you now, not as bitterness, as clarity. You still remember those nights, the silence, the loneliness, the feeling of screaming without sound. It's what made you. It's what reshaped you. They weren't there for your breaking point. They don't get credit for your comeback. You rose alone. You healed alone. And now you protect that peace like your life depends on it. Because it does. You saw their pain and wanted to fix it. That's how it started. You weren't trying to be a savior. You just didn't want them to feel what you'd felt. So you poured yourself out. Late night talks, long messages, showing up even when they pushed you away. You tried to be their safe place. You thought if you just loved them enough, they'd eventually heal. They didn't. Some people don't want to be better. They just want someone to be broken with them so they don't have to chain. You excused the mood swings, the anger, the silence. You told yourself they were just hurting, and that pain made people messy. You were patient, waiting for the version of them you believed existed underneath all that chaos. You convinced yourself they'd change. They didn't. What they needed was a mirror, not a lifeline. But you kept offering your hand, hoping this time they'd grab it with intention. You ended up dragging them instead, carrying their weight while they refused to stand. They called it love when you stayed. They called you loyal for not leaving. But none of it was real. You were loyal to a version of them they never became. You weren't being loved. You were being used, and you knew it. Somewhere in your chest, you knew. But you ignored it, because you didn't want to believe that someone could be so comfortable staying broken, that someone would rather remain in their darkness than meet you in the light. They didn't want solutions. They wanted sympathy, but not the kind that heals, the kind that feeds the victim narrative. And you gave it over and over. You watered dead flowers. You gave warmth to people who had no intention of thawing. They didn't want to rise. They wanted you to kneel beside them. They wanted someone to blame, someone to bleed on, someone to hold responsible for wounds they refused to close. You thought your consistency could save them. It didn't, because presence doesn't help someone who's addicted to pain. You gave your best advice. You stayed through their worst nights. You made excuses for their behavior, told yourself it was just trauma. But you were the only one trying. You were the only one moving, the only one breaking cycles. And that's not love. That's one-sided destruction. There were moments when they showed softness, moments when you thought, they're finally changing. And then it would fall apart again, back to the cold, the lies, the guilt-tripping. It wasn't growth. It was manipulation dressed up as vulnerability. And you bought it, because you wanted to believe in the good. You always do. You've always had a soft spot for broken people. Because once, you were broken too. But you chose healing. They didn't. There's a difference between broken and lazy, between hurt and harmful. Some people use their pain as a weapon, as a reason to be cruel, as a pass to never change. And the worst part, they'll make you feel guilty for trying to help. They'll twist your care into control, your advice into attack. They'll punish you for showing them the mirror, then expect you to still love them while they smash it. You kept showing up, even when it hurt, even when it drained you. You put your needs second, your healing on hold. You poured into them with an empty cup. And when you needed support, silence, confusion, blame. You were there for their mess. But when your hands shook, no one held them. They were never going to lift you. They were only there to lean on you until you collapsed. They made you believe you were responsible for their healing. You weren't. You were just convenient, a cushion, a distraction from the work they refused to do. And the moment you set boundaries, you became the villain. The second you said, enough, they called you selfish. Because they never loved you for you. They loved your usefulness, your softness, your willingness to stay. You started to realize they weren't changing, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want to. Healing requires accountability. Growth requires discomfort, and they weren't ready for either. They wanted peace, but not the work. Love, but not effort. Growth, but not responsibility. And you couldn't carry both your healing and theirs. So, you stopped. Not because you didn't care anymore, but because you cared too much for yourself to keep bleeding. There was no apology, no thank you, just silence, or worse, anger, as if you betrayed them by choosing peace. They wanted you soft, soft enough to stay, soft enough to keep tolerating the damage. But you outgrew that softness. You started choosing yourself. You stopped offering therapy in the form of love. You stopped being the antidote to wounds that were self-inflicted. You learned that love doesn't fix people, that you can't save someone who refuses to swim, that presence doesn't equal healing if the other person is committed to staying stuck. And it broke your heart, because you didn't leave out of hate. You left out of exhaustion, out of self-preservation, out of the quiet realization that you deserve the same energy you give, that your softness deserves safety. You don't hate them. You just stopped hoping. You stopped waiting for them to change. You stopped offering yourself on altars where your soul kept burning. They made you feel like caring was weakness, like boundaries were betrayal. But the truth is, they weren't afraid of losing you. They were afraid of losing the version of you that kept staying. They regret losing that person now, but they never thought you'd stop being soft and that's what they'll carry forever. You started out soft, not weak, just open. You gave people more than they earned. You believed in them before they gave you a reason. You listened, even when they lied. You showed up when you were running on empty, not because they deserved it, but because that's who you were. Someone who cared, someone who hoped, someone who kept giving even when it hurt. And you told yourself that being good would be enough, that if you kept loving, eventually they would love you back the same way. You were wrong. They didn't value it. They didn't protect it. They used it until it became inconvenient, until your kindness started asking for consistency. That's when the calls stopped. That's when the tone changed. That's when they said you were asking for too much, when all you wanted was, yes, presence. Not gifts, not praise. Just someone who meant it when they said, I'm here. But they weren't. And still, you stayed. You gave them the benefit of the doubt, again and again. You made excuses for their absence. You told yourself they were busy, that they were going through something, that they'd come around. You fought for connections that were draining you. You fought alone, and they let you. Not because they didn't know, but because they didn't care enough to fight with you. So you started changing, not loudly, not out of spite, quietly, gradually. You stopped texting first. You stopped checking in. You stopped apologizing just to keep the peace. You stopped begging for conversations that felt forced, and they noticed, but not in a curious way, in a defensive one. They called you distant, cold, said you changed, and yes, you did, but not because you wanted to, because they gave you no choice. They called you selfish when you stopped people-pleasing, when you said no, when you stopped making yourself available for people who never made space for you. Suddenly, you were the villain in their story, not because you hurt them, but because you stopped letting them hurt you. You didn't start hurting people. You just stopped saving them, stopped showing up where your absence went unnoticed, stopped pouring from a cup that no one helped fill. And they hated that, because your love was convenient. Your softness made them feel superior. They liked you better when you had no boundaries, when your worth depended on how much you gave. The moment you stopped sacrificing your peace, you became a problem. But you weren't angry. You weren't out for revenge. You were just tired of explaining yourself, of overthinking every message, of waiting for people to match your effort. You learned that silence is an answer, that disappearing says more than any confrontation ever could. So you pulled back, not because you didn't care, but because you finally cared about yourself more. They never saw how hard it was for you, how many nights you cried quietly, how many times you blamed yourself for the way they treated you. You thought maybe you were too sensitive, too emotional, too much. But the truth is, you were never too much. You were just surrounded by people who were too little. You stopped trying to be enough for people who weren't even trying. You stopped shrinking yourself to fit into spaces that were never meant to hold you. You stopped letting loyalty keep you in places where love was one-sided. And in doing that, you didn't lose people. You revealed them. You saw who only came around when they needed something, who only supported you when it benefited them, who disappeared when things got hard. And the hardest part, some of them were people you would have done anything for, people you loved with every part of you. That's what changed you. Not the loss, but the realization that not everyone has the same heart, that not everyone knows how to love without conditions. So yes, you got quiet. You stopped sharing so much. You became more private. You stopped offering your energy so freely. And people didn't like that, because now they had to earn access. Now they had to show up. Now they had to give something back. And most of them weren't capable of that. But you didn't close your heart. You just locked the door. And not everyone gets a key. Not anymore. Because being soft in a world that takes advantage of softness is dangerous. It almost broke you. Almost made you forget who you were. And now that you've found yourself again, you protect that version fiercely. You still love, but now your love has boundaries. You still care, but your care has limits. You don't chase people anymore. You don't explain your worth. You let actions speak. You let silence make the noise. You no longer keep people in your life out of history or habit. You keep them based on effort, on respect, on how they treat you when you have nothing to offer. They never thought you'd change. They never thought you'd walk away. They thought you'd stay soft forever. That no matter what they did, you'd still come running. That's why they're shocked now. That's why they call you cold. But what they call cold, you call growth. What they call rude, you call boundaries. What they call distance, you call healing. You didn't change overnight. It took time, pain, isolation. It took every piece of you falling apart before you realized that being soft with everyone was killing you slowly. You didn't become cruel. You became careful. And that's something they'll never understand, because they only knew the version of you that kept breaking just to keep others comfortable. They don't know the version that finally chose peace, chose self-respect, chose survival. You used to talk a lot, not to be heard but to be understood. You explained your actions, your silence, your tears. You broke yourself into simple pieces so they wouldn't misunderstand you. You gave context, background, softened your voice so it wouldn't sound like anger, even when you were bleeding. You explained things they never even asked about. You wanted to be seen, truly seen, but they only looked. They never really listened. They called you dramatic, sensitive, emotional, and you carried those labels like shame, like something was wrong with caring too much. You thought if you just communicated better, they'd love you right. That maybe if you used the right tone, the right words, they'd finally stop hurting you. So you talked through betrayal, talked through disrespect. You forgave in real time while explaining why you were still hurting. They didn't change. They just got better at making you explain yourself. There were nights you rehearsed what you wanted to say, only to say none of it. You'd walk into conversations ready to defend your feelings and walk out wondering why you still felt alone. You started talking less, not because you had less to say, but because you realized no one was really listening. They were waiting to respond, waiting to flip it back on you, waiting to win. It was never a conversation. It was always a defense. So you got quiet, not because you had nothing to say, but because saying it wasn't changing anything. Your voice became something sacred, something no longer available on demand. You stopped arguing, stopped explaining what they already knew. People know when they're hurting you. They just count on your softness to tolerate it. And for a long time, you did. You let love convince you to stay where you weren't respected. You let connection override peace, until silence became the only truth that didn't betray you. Now you let them talk, let them wonder, let them imagine the thoughts behind your quiet eyes. They don't know this version of you. The one that doesn't explain, the one that doesn't shrink in discomfort. You used to clear the air. Now you let the fog sit. Let them feel the confusion you once choked on. They ask what's wrong, and you say, nothing, because everything that was wrong was already said multiple times, and they ignored it every time. You stopped correcting people's narratives. If they want to misunderstand you, they can. You no longer lose sleep trying to make liars tell the truth. You no longer fight to prove you were good. You know you were, and that's enough. Your silence now is not passive. It's power. It's your way of saying, you had your chance. You knew the truth. You chose comfort over honesty. People confuse your silence with peace. It's not always peace. Sometimes it's the exhaustion from years of begging to be heard. Sometimes it's all the words stuck in your throat because you know they wouldn't matter anyway. Sometimes silence is the loudest grief. Other times it's the calm after a storm you survived alone. Either way, it's yours now. You don't owe anyone an explanation for why you no longer speak on what hurt you. The same people who once ignored your pain now ask why you're so quiet, as if your silence is the problem, as if they didn't earn it. They miss the version of you that cared enough to fight, that would sit down and write paragraphs to explain why your heart hurt. That version of you is gone, not bitter, not broken, just done. You don't walk back into burning buildings after you've made it out alive. Now you watch instead of speak. You observe instead of engage. You know that most people only apologize when their access is threatened, not because they're truly sorry. You learn the difference between someone who's sorry they hurt you and someone who's sorry they lost control over you. You stopped answering to guilt. You stopped letting loyalty make you tolerate harm. You walk away now, quietly, completely. People say you've changed. They're right. You no longer use your voice to beg for decency. You use your absence to protect your peace. You realize that your softness was mistaken for permission, that your forgiveness was seen as weakness. They never thought you'd stop trying, never thought you'd go silent. They thought you'd stay soft forever. But pain doesn't just change people. It reveals them. Now, when you go silent, it's final. It means you no longer believe your words are safe in their hands. It means you've stopped hoping for change. It means you've accepted the truth. That's the hardest part. Accepting that some people never cared as much as you did. That some people only loved the version of you that stayed soft, even while breaking. They wanted access to your heart, but not the responsibility to protect it. They can talk all they want, write paragraphs, spread rumors, pretend they don't know what happened, but they're talking to a ghost, to a version of you that doesn't live here anymore. You left that softness in the same place they left your voice, unheard. You've grown past the need to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. And that's freedom, not silence as surrender, silence as survival. Now your boundaries speak for you. Your absence speaks for you. Your glow speaks for you. And they're loud, so let them talk, let them wonder, let them search for the softness they once knew. They won't find it. It wasn't stolen. It wasn't destroyed. You buried it yourself, out of love, for you. You started soft, not fake soft, not performative, real, genuine. You cared when no one else did. You asked how they were and meant it. You remembered the small things. You showed up even when they didn't. It wasn't strategy. It was just who you were. You believed that love could fix people, that patience would be enough, that kindness was a language everyone understood. But you were wrong. They loved that version of you. The version that said sorry even when it wasn't your fault. The one that stayed silent just to keep the peace. The one who always answered the phone, even when your own world was falling apart. You didn't love halfway. You gave it all, every time. And not once did you keep score. You showed up at your own expense. You put your needs second, sometimes last. They never noticed. You thought loyalty meant staying no matter what. You thought helping someone grow meant shrinking yourself for a while. You thought being soft meant being safe, but softness doesn't protect you. It exposes you. It turns your chest into open air for others to walk through. They didn't ask if you were okay. They assumed you were. You were the strong one, right? The listener, the healer, the one who always bounced back. You didn't notice the slow burn at first, the small moments where your kindness was met with convenience, how they only came around when they needed something, how your silence made their lives easier. You kept telling yourself it was love, that they cared, just in their own way. But there comes a point when even lies stop working on yourself, even the gentle ones you were understanding, until it cost your peace. You kept forgiving the same mistakes. You allowed things you knew weren't okay because you were afraid of losing them. You stayed longer than you should have, hoping they'd finally understand your heart. They never did. They didn't want to. Why would they? You made it easy. You never required much. You just wanted effort. And somehow, even that was too much. You cried quietly, on buses, in bathrooms, at night, in bed, while the world slept. You didn't want to burden anyone. You wore the weight like it was part of your skin. You were hurting, but still answering messages, still making sure everyone else felt seen. You were the support system you never had. You didn't ask for help because you knew they wouldn't show up. It wasn't an overnight change. It was a slow build, 1,000 moments where you bit your tongue, where you smiled through pain, where you gave someone the benefit of the doubt for the 15th time. It added up. And one day, something in you broke, quietly. No explosion, no dramatic meltdown, just a click, a shift. You looked around and saw clearly no one was coming to save you. You stopped explaining why you were hurt, stopped hoping they'd care enough to notice. You stopped making excuses for their behavior. You accepted what you didn't want to believe. If they cared, you'd feel it. If they valued you, you wouldn't be questioning it. And so you stopped waiting. You stopped trying. Not out of anger, out of exhaustion, out of clarity. You still cared. That didn't disappear. But you started saving that care for people who earned it. You began choosing silence over begging, peace over proving, distance over desperation. You didn't need a dramatic exit. You just stopped showing up where you weren't seen. That was enough. The absence spoke louder than the years of loyalty ever could. They noticed the shift. Suddenly, your silence made noise. They asked why you were different, why you stopped being so available. They missed the old you, the one who would have dropped everything just to make them feel better. But that version of you died quietly, in all those nights where you held back tears just to comfort someone else, in all those messages you sent, trying to fix what someone else broke. You gave too much. You know that now, but you won't apologize for it. That softness wasn't weakness. It was rare, but rare things can't be handed out freely. You learned that lesson the hard way, through broken trust, through empty thank yous, through people who only loved what you could give, not who you were. Now you move differently. Your silence isn't empty. It's intentional. Your boundaries aren't walls. They're self-respect. You're still kind, still warm, but now there are limits. Now there are standards. You still love, but not blindly. You still give, but not to everyone. You're no longer the soft landing for people who made life hard for you. You aren't cold. You're cautious, and you earned that right. They underestimated you because you were gentle, because you forgave easily, because you didn't scream when they hurt you. But quiet people break too. And when they do, they don't come back the same. They come back smarter, stronger, unavailable. You didn't ask for this change. It was forced on you. But now that it's here, you won't go back. You outgrew that softness, not because love is wrong, but because yours was wasted. Now you move with intent. You speak with weight. You stay silent when it's louder than words. You learned how to protect yourself, and they'll regret ever thinking you wouldn't. You started off soft. That wasn't a weakness. That was your nature. You cared too much, felt too much, gave too much. You let people in without asking what they were carrying. You assumed everyone had the same heart as you. You thought that being good would be enough, that showing up, being loyal, being honest, would be returned. You were always the one who checked in, the one who remembered the little things, the one who stayed up late on calls for people who wouldn't answer if you needed them. You didn't even notice you were bleeding because you were too focused on making sure everyone else was okay. You gave, and they kept taking. They didn't ask if you were tired. They didn't think twice before unloading their mess on you. You were the strong one, the dependable one, the one who could handle it. You never asked for much, just the same effort you gave, the same energy, the same loyalty, but it didn't come. You were their safe space. But when you needed someone to sit in your storm with you, no one showed up. You were left alone with all the weight you tried to carry for everyone else. And somehow they still made you feel guilty for not doing more. You started noticing the pattern. People only came around when they needed something, when they were lonely, when their life was falling apart. You were never their first call when they were celebrating. You were the emergency contact, never the invited guest. That's what hurt the most. Not the silence, but the selective love, the one-sided loyalty. You weren't appreciated. You were used. Still, you stayed soft for a while. You gave people the benefit of the doubt. You kept hoping they'd change, that they'd notice, that they'd match your energy. But they never did. And over time, your patience started to run dry. You stopped blaming yourself. You stopped wondering if you were too much. You started seeing people for who they really were, not who you wanted them to be. There wasn't one big moment that changed you. It was slow, quiet, the constant disappointments, the constant explaining, the constant feeling like you were begging to be treated right. Something inside you just shut off. You stopped giving people access to your softness so easily, not out of hate, but because you were tired of being the only one who cared. They call you cold now. They say you've changed, that you're distant, that you don't feel like yourself. But they only say that because they can't use you the same way. You're not cruel. You're just cautious. You don't let people back in without watching how they move. You don't listen to promises. You wait for proof. You've learned that people love to talk about loyalty, but rarely live it. You watch energy now, not words. You pay attention to how they show up when you have nothing to offer, when there's no benefit, when it's inconvenient. You've learned to read between the lines, to recognize when someone's affection is just manipulation wrapped in sweet talk. You don't respond to "I miss you." You wait to see effort, because if they meant it, you'd feel it. You used to miss people. Now you miss how you felt when you didn't know any better, when your love was naive, when your heart didn't flinch at red flags. But you're not bitter. You're just done explaining your worth. You don't argue anymore. You don't chase anyone. If someone wants to leave, you hold the door open. You stopped trying to prove yourself to people who never really saw you. They didn't expect you to stop caring. That's what shook them. They thought you'd always be there, that no matter how many times they disappeared, you'd answer. You'd stay soft. You'd stay available. But you've learned that love without boundaries is just self-sabotage. You stopped letting people treat you like a convenience. You're not colder, you're smarter. You've just learned that not everyone deserves the best parts of you. You don't offer your softness to people who confuse it with weakness. Your heart still loves, but now it's guarded, not shut down, protected. You still care, but only for those who show they're worth the energy. They regret it now, the way they handled you, the things they said, the chances they wasted, because now they don't have access. They feel your absence. They see your growth. And it stings, because they thought you'd stay small, stay available, stay soft forever. But you didn't. You evolved. Now you walk away with ease. You say no without guilt. You protect your peace without explaining. And that silence, that indifference, that's what haunts them. They can't guilt you anymore, can't emotionally pull you back in. You don't respond to chaos, you only answer peace. That's the change they never saw coming. You didn't become mean, you became real. You don't tolerate disrespect just to keep the peace. You stopped shrinking to make others feel comfortable. You stopped ignoring how you feel just to avoid making waves. Now you're your own protector. You don't break your back for people who wouldn't lift a finger for you. They thought you'd never walk away. They thought they had forever access. But people forget. Kindness is not a weakness. And once a soft heart stops caring, it's never the same again. They thought you'd stay soft. That's why it hurts now, 'cause they lost something rare. And you didn't even have to say a word. Your growth said everything. You were kind. You didn't perform it. It wasn't some strategy or mask. It was your default setting. You gave without waiting to be asked. You stayed when you had every reason to leave. You answered late-night messages, checked on people who disappeared the moment they felt better. You forgave before apologies were even spoken. You remembered birthdays no one remembered back. You held space for everyone, even when no one held it for you. You were soft, not weak. But they couldn't tell the difference. They thought your patience meant passivity, that your gentleness meant you didn't know how to bite back. They misunderstood everything. Or maybe they understood it too well and just saw it as an opening. They knew you'd say yes, knew you'd show up, knew they could vent to you, lean on you, break in front of you, without ever offering to carry any of your weight. They got used to it, got comfortable with your silence. They thought it was endless. There's something painful about realizing your warmth is only valued when it's convenient. You gave people the best parts of you without conditions. You gave chances when they didn't deserve one. You explained yourself when you shouldn't have. You stayed in conversations you had outgrown. You gave them safety, softness, loyalty, and in return, you got taken for granted, over and over. And still, you didn't stop, because you weren't doing it to get something back. You were doing it because it's who you were. But that version of you bled too much. They never asked how much it cost you to stay soft in a world that doesn't care. They didn't see the tears you wiped quietly. They didn't know the nights you sat awake, questioning why you always ended up the one left behind, the one ignored, the one they remembered only when they needed something. Your kindness never screamed. It never demanded. It didn't guilt or chase. It just gave, again and again, and they kept taking. Some even thought it was your role, to be available, to be reliable, to be the safe landing when their choices crashed. You watched people praise loyalty while betraying you. You listened to them talk about respect while ignoring your boundaries. They complimented your light while trying to dim it. And still, you stayed kind. Still, you believed maybe this time would be different. Maybe if you gave a little more, loved a little louder, stayed a little longer, they'd finally see. But they didn't. They only saw what they could use, And when your softness didn't serve them anymore, they disappeared. You used to think being kind meant always being open, always being the bigger person, always giving the benefit of the doubt. But then came the exhaustion, the burnout no one noticed, the emotional hangovers from carrying everyone else's mess. You were the helper, the healer, the one they ran to. But when you needed anything, silence, excuses, absence. You learned quickly that being kind doesn't protect you. It exposes you. It marks you as the easy one, the forgettable one, the one who forgives too fast. It hurt. The shift didn't happen overnight. It started quietly. A pause before you replied, a hesitation before you offered help. You started watching more than speaking, not because you stopped caring, but because you started noticing. You noticed who only reached out when they needed something, who never checked in, who changed when you had boundaries, who disappeared when you stopped being endlessly available. It stung, but it was clarity, and clarity is never gentle. You used to romanticize your softness. Now you understand it needs protection. It needs direction. You still love. You still show up. But now you ask questions. Now you have limits. You don't pour into empty cups anymore. You don't fix broken people who cut you while calling it love. You don't try to make people see your worth. You just leave when they don't. You were never asking for perfection. Just effort. Just respect. Just realness. But some people can't meet you there, and it's not your job to pull them up. Not anymore. You learned that your softness is not for everyone. It's not meant to be accessed by every hand. Some people are clumsy with what's sacred. They don't deserve it. And you're no longer ashamed of your softness, but you're no longer offering it like it costs nothing. Because it does. It costs energy, time, mental peace. It costs parts of you that you can't keep giving away. You've earned the right to say no without guilt, to love without losing yourself, to care without being careless with your own needs. They thought you'd always stay the same, that no matter how many times they left you bleeding, you'd come back. But they were wrong. Your kindness is still there. It just has conditions now, requirements. You're not cold. You're just no longer willing to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. You're not bitter. You're just done pretending their behavior doesn't hurt. You still smile, still give, still love, but differently, with awareness, with limits, with standards. You can be soft and still say enough. You can be kind and still walk away. You don't have to become cruel to stop being used. You just have to stop allowing people to mistake your grace for weakness. And now, they notice the change. They feel the distance. They reach out, but not because they care, because they feel the loss. They miss the version of you that never said no, that stayed kind, no matter how they acted. That version is gone, buried under every ignored message, every selfish excuse, every quiet heartbreak you had to process alone. They thought you'd stay soft forever. That was their mistake.